So welcome to this seminar. I'm happy to see so many people here. We have extra chairs if needed. I'm very happy to have Jesper Roine here. It's not easy to get him here always. He's very busy. We're going to talk about economic inequality, what it means, what we know, and maybe a bit on why it matters. And this is something we've been very interested in. We had Daniel Waldenström here, working a little bit with the same data as you, giving him one interpretation, which might contrast with yours. Jesper is Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics and Deputy Director of the Stockholm Institute for Transition Economics site, which deals a lot with Ukraine, so that's one reason why you're so busy. He got his PhD from Stockholm University, 2002, and of course, Jesper is well known for collaborating with Thomas Piketty. He, together with Daniel Waldenström, I think delivered all the Swedish data in the International Top Income Research Program that Piketty was boss for, so to say. And you also wrote, Piketty wrote a terribly long book about this, but you don't need to read it because you wrote a 100-page excellent summary of that, which I can recommend. You wrote a dissertation on the political economics of not paying taxes. That doesn't not happen. And of course, I already mentioned you published this book about Piketty. You also published a lot of papers that have been very much cited. Resource curse or not, a question of appropriability. That's cited by more than 1,000 people, I noticed. Not bad. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. And yes, indeed, I've written a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about research-wise together with Daniel Waldenström. And I basically hence agree with all of the sort of facts that we conclude from our research, but the interpretation is maybe not always the same, but we'll see. So full disclosure, I tried to cancel this seminar 2 weeks ago because the stuff I was planning on presenting is not done. So I was thinking I better postpone so I can have something interesting and new to talk about. But Gustav pressured me into coming anyway. So that put me in an interesting spot because I had to think about, well, what on earth should I talk about then? But it turns out that it's maybe not such a bad idea to take a step back and try to sort of think about what I'm working on currently and how it sort of relates to this topic more broadly. And especially, I guess, for this audience where I'm guessing not everyone is sort of working in economics on economic inequality. Not everything that's sort of is a sort of background for that kind of crowd is some of that might be novel for you, and hopefully my take on it is also a bit new. So, and why is this not working? There we go. Just as a short overview on what I plan to talk about, I'm basically going to start off with this sort of the background question, which is why inequality is an economics question at all, or whether it should be. And that might sound as a bit of a strange question to pose even, but I'm going to show you that there's quite a lot of skepticism in the amongst economists, and basically there are a couple of different varying reasons, and I'm going to try to explain what those are and why I think the people who hold those views are mistaken. And these points turn out to be important also for what comes later in the presentation then, which is more closely related to what I'm and many others in this field are thinking about or have been thinking about over the past, say, 10, 15 years or so. So I'm then going to move on to the measurement of inequality. This is especially in economics. This is, to talk about the distribution of something, you need to measure something that we can have a distribution over, right? The question is, what should that be? And how have people thought about this? And my sort of short view on this is that in the subject of economics, going back to 19th century writings about this, there was initially, classical economists had an idea about a very macro kind of distributional question, which sort of moved from what is the distribution between labor incomes, capital incomes, and rent, basically. These were the big aggregates, because people essentially thought of the distribution as being between workers and capitalists and landowners, etc. Sort of class version of the distribution. While as this has then moved much more towards a more micro-oriented, which is like the individual distribution or over households, individual households. And in this, turns out that there's some stuff lost in this transition from macro to micro. And much of recent work has really been about sort of reconnecting to the macro picture. So I'm going to try to explain that. And indeed, this point, the disagreement about that link, that in one sentence is where basically all of the disagreements about whether incomes have increased, income inequality has increased, how to think about wealth inequality, the role of wealth in relation to income. Most of the disagreements really come about from this linkage. Should we focus on what economists call the distributed income, so i.e. what is sort of paid out to households, and how should we then think about that? Turns out to be only 50-60% of GDP or so. How should we think about the rest, which is sometimes retained earnings in companies, or it's companies growing, and what's the link there? Or government programs of different kinds. How should we think about that? And then the plan is to link this to the Swedish debate and to what has happened and what people claim has happened and why there's disagreement about this. Okay, so sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. Parts of this is one book that Gustav did not mention, but it's in Swedish, so still only in Swedish. But I wrote this couple of years ago, 2023, about this question, and parts of the introduction here are about that. And it also contains a bunch of things that I'm not going to talk about, like there's the whole question about global inequality, inequalities between countries, how should we think about poverty, the question of poverty, what has happened to poverty in different countries, how does it relate to inequality, etc. There's a whole bunch of those things. There's also a bunch of things that I've done on the gender aspect of this. I think that's, maybe I can come back, give a different seminar on how to think about this, because I think that's another area where there's a lot of interesting things to think about, whether we should focus on individuals or households and what that does to the potential distribution between men and women, since as soon as we consider them a household, we're sort of assuming that it's equally shared within the household. This turns out to have pretty big consequences for how to think about that development. So, I'm already worried about how to get through my 51 slides given the speed I'm going right now. So I'll just,
You had enough material.
Yeah. I desperately took everything I ever thought of. No, that's not it. So I'll just, preview the conclusions in if we don't get through it, but I'll do my best. So first of all, inequality to me obviously matters. It matters in its own right because of connections to fairness, justice, ethics, all these questions. And I think it's legitimate for economists to think about these questions. But I think the case is even stronger for what I would call a sort of positive reason for thinking about economics, which is that I think there's a lot of evidence and a lot of theory suggesting that inequality actually matters for the functioning of the economy. So for that reason, even if you don't have sort of normative statements to make, even if you're, only interested in how the economy works and to explain that, then I think the inequality question is key. I'll try to explain why. And then, as I already mentioned, many of the disagreements have to do with this linkage between macro and micro levels of resources in the economy, how we should think about that. And when it comes to the case of Sweden, this is a good example in terms of what has happened. Many of the disagreements have to do with the fact that people don't sufficiently disaggregate the fact that inequality is driven or can be driven by different parts of or different types of income, and it can vary across the distribution. And it's very clear, or at least I think, if you want to sort of make one statement, of course there's fluctuations or you can have degrees in this, but to me, basically nothing has happened in terms of labor income inequality. It's not the distribution of wages or the distribution of labor income that has become more skewed. And this is different to many other countries. So in the US, for example, it's very clearly the wage distribution. And that's not the case in Sweden. Instead, what drives the observed disposable income inequality, I'll get back to exactly what that means, but that's versions of capital income. And there we can disagree about which parts of that capital income should be included and, to what extent that reveals something real. And I'll get back to that as well. But then one of the most sort of neglected parts is the fact that wealth has become very important in relation to income flows. So if you measure, and this I'll be clearer on also in that part, if you measure the size of wealth, the value of wealth in relation to the yearly flow of income, wealth has increased in importance. And this, of course, matters for the distribution of sort of total economic resources, regardless of how you think about that. And importantly, and this is perhaps where I disagree with some of the people who point to that, well, if we look at sort of the flow measure, and then we claim that, well, nothing much has happened in the distribution of a flow, and we say that, well, there's also another part which is the stock of all wealth, and nothing much has happened to the distribution of that either. Those two statements together do not mean that inequality in total has not changed. Why? Well, because if the proportion between these two change, and we know that one of them, that is wealth, is much, much more unequal in its distribution. If wealth matters more, then even if the distribution does not change towards a more unequal distribution, the total, the sum of those two distributions will be more unequal, right? So this is something I'll come back to. Okay, so let me now try to be kind of quick on this first part, where I want to sort of end up with a framework which I think is useful for thinking about how inequality matters for economics. So as promised, this posing this question is not just out of the blue. This is a statement by Robert Lucas. Robert Lucas is not just any odd economist. He's a Nobel laureate, one of the most respected macroeconomists, and he's pointed to the study of distribution as one of the most harmful to sound economics, the most seductive, and in my opinion, the most poisonous. Now, these are not small words in terms of how far we should stay away from distributional questions. I'll get back to what, as always, if you cut like one part of a sentence, this is not really fair, right? Because he says something which I think is true after this. And I'll give you the full quote. But, behind this lies two types of criticism. One of them has to do with an old idea in the field, which is, this distinction that some economists insist on between economics as a positive science versus normative statements. And there's a quote by Lionel Robbins from an essay in the 30s, which is well known. It's simply saying that economics should deal with ascertainable facts, ethics with values and obligations. The two fields of inquiry are not on the same plane of discourse, etc. So this, of course, has a strong hold in economics. This distinction. Some have even gone much further, and also for those of you who are not familiar, Martin Feldstein is also not just any odd economist. He was a professor at Harvard and one of the most cited, economists in several fields: public economics, macro, etc. So this is the distinction, positive, normative. The other, and this is what the continuation of Robert Lucas's point, is that, look, the problem with focusing on distributional questions is simply that if you think about the importance of having continuous economic growth over a long period of time, the importance of that value creation is sort of dwarfs any discussion about how we should divide what we have currently. And this is true, right? So, but I'll come back to why he's still wrong in terms of saying that the distributional aspects hence should be neglected. So basically, this is all of the points that say that as soon as you start thinking about redistribution or distributive issues, then you're somehow hurting the growth process. That's essentially what this is saying, and I think that's wrong. Okay, now something happened here. Okay, so first on this normative issue. I think a lot of economists would agree that, sure, it's different to make positive normative statements. This is one area where, to this crowd, I'm guessing, I should not sort of wade into deep water here. Just state that, it's possible to make welfare statements, and economists do that all the time. I mean, if you take any textbook or look at any article, there's all these sort of statements about optimal taxes or optimal this or that or optimal policies. Well, at least you have to acknowledge that there's somewhere in the background you have some idea of a social welfare function on which you're basing this optimality claim, right?
So didn't one of your former people say it was better with a Pareto improvement?
Sorry?
Even your critics there said it was better with a Pareto improvement.
Yeah, no, so we'll come to the what a Pareto improvement actually means. We'll get to that. But as I think, if you want to read a great article on this. Read Tony Atkinson's 2008 paper, Economics as a Moral Science. That goes through a lot of this and makes some very, very good points on this. And he points to exactly that. Economists often assume that there's agreement on this when there's actually not. So what's wrong with this acceptance of the Pareto principle? Well, only spiteful egalitarians apparently reject the Pareto principle, but most economists agree that if someone gains, even that if that someone is a richer person and no one loses, then that's good. Now, the problem here, I think, probably not for Feldstein. I'm sure he had thought about this and many other things, but in the discussions about this, in the debate, the problem here is that people don't make a distinction between income gains and the utility of those income gains. That's the key, right? So let me show you an example of what I mean, and this is something just to engage you a bit. This is what I torture my students with occasionally when talking about this. It's just a thought experiment to think about which of the following worlds you'd prefer. One where you have 25,000 of whatever unit you choose, and others have 50. Or one where you have 24 and others have 12. Or one where everyone has 12. And assume for a second that prices or what you can buy with this money is equal across these worlds. So 50 always buys more stuff than 25, which buys more stuff than 24, etc. Right? Now, which would you prefer? Can we get a hands up in terms of who prefers one?
Depends on other factors.
Let's
say the power, for example, is that?
Okay, yeah. We'll get to that. Hold your horses. Now we're pure economists here. Everything that the world revolves around is consumption, right? So. Yeah, okay. So assume you survive okay on 12. So it's way above some poverty line. So
population is fixed. We need a microphone if you're gonna have none of this.
No, I don't want to dwell on this. Right? So, okay, you vote for one. There's a couple of ones. Any twos? Two. Okay.
I vote for 1, 2 if everything is included.
Yeah. Okay.
On the assumption that I kind of know what you're asking.
Yeah. Okay. So it's clear that this is not well specified, right? And it's deliberately not well specified because it's a discussion starter, right? Because this is typically the kinds of results I get. So it's much more common that people prefer this. I.e. that 24 is better than 12. Quite a lot of people say 25 is, while everyone else has 50. But interestingly, a lot of people don't say this based on 25 being more than 24, which is more than 12, but based on some kind of altruistic idea that why should I rob all of society of all of this money, etc. Now, why am I pointing to these things? Well, simply because if you take a pure sort of consumption, my individual consumption is all that matters, then it's clear that 25 is better than 24 is better than 12, and everything else we can neglect, right? But turns out that people have all sorts of ideas, and at a very minimum, many of these indicate that there's some different kind of utility function which includes your consumption possibilities in relation to what others have, with sometimes some status component. I want to have more than others, but in other cases an altruistic idea that I want others to have as much as possible as well, etc. Right? Now this is a positive statement. about how the world works, right? This is not, to me, a normative statement. I'm not making any claims about how people, unlike Feldstein, right? I'm not making any claims about what people should think or should not think. Just saying that, look, people seem to care about the distributional aspects as well. And that's likely to have consequences. That's my point. Okay. The other type of question, let me move on to that. If growth is important, then inequality is not. Is that what we should conclude? Well, again, Lucas is absolutely correct in pointing out that if we sort of stop the world in 1820 and then we start haggling about global income in 1820 and the distribution of that, at the expense of having an industrial revolution and a subsequent sort of 200 years of economic growth, there are so many ways in which we can have better for everyone type distributions 200 years later if we focus on growth. That's his basic point. But what's implicitly assumed, if you say that this means that we should not care about distributional questions, is that as soon as you care about distributional questions, you're somehow hurting the growth process. And this, I think, is wrong. Okay. So let's first look at what are the economic models. If you take all sorts of economic models, it's clear that there are incentive effects. I mean, the whole subject is based on choice being a sort of waiting between should I do this, should I do that, which pays me the most. That's absolutely every type of decision problem in an economist's world has that kind of structure, right? So of course there needs to be differences in terms of outcomes. That's what economic incentives are. So clearly no one is saying that. Clearly no economist is saying that there are not disincentive effects from taxes, etc. So can we please stop sort of pretending that as soon as you say I care about redistribution, I'm somehow neglecting this. I'm not. I'm just saying that, well, I should say there are other reasons for why we might want to have concentration of wealth, for example. Even Keynes points out that, high degree of concentration of wealth was necessary for some investments, etc. And there are many economic growth models that have this component of a fixed cost investment being needed. And if all the resources are too spread out, then no one has that, possibility to make that kind of investment. So, we can argue about that. But importantly, there are all sorts of reasons for why inequalities, if they are too large or if big chunks of the population are too poor, this also stops individuals from doing all sorts of productive things, both individually and socially, right? And so in the interest of time, I'm not going to speak about this, but there's tons, right? So it's an empirical question. What's the relation between inequality and growth? Now, this, unfortunately, is a question that's from my point of view, impossible to answer. Why? Because it's too vague. It's unclear what you mean by inequality and growth here. But to the extent, I had an interesting discussion with a person who's done a lot of the work in this, and he basically said that, look, I know all of the pitfalls and problems with trying to answer this question, but it turns out that this is a question a lot of people want an answer to. So I better try to give them one, so. And to the extent that we can say something, it's at least very clear that it's not universally true that unequal countries grow faster than equal countries. If anything, it's the other way around. If anything, with all the bells and whistles and ways to adjust and account for endogeneity, etc., when we try to look at this, if anything, it seems that it's negatively correlated, right?
So are you talking about inequality of income or wealth or both there?
So this is of income. This is typically income, but it's so again here you come to should we look at some kind of measure like the Gini coefficient? Does that capture everything? There are some of these papers that look specifically at, is it worse if like the top has more, or is it better if the bottom has a lot relative to the median, etc. So there's a lot of work on that. But my reading is definitely that if you're looking for an average answer to the question, it's rather that having low inequalities is positive for growth rather than the other way around. But from that, I would not conclude that at every stage we should try to push inequality down for some kind of growth reasons. I don't think that follows. But, all of this is just relating to this discussion, how should we think about inequality in relation to the functioning of the economy? Now, let me move to, since I know that this is something that Gustav brought up here. There's one type of channel that I did not discuss here, and that's the political channel. And if you look at the sort of literature on this, there are essentially two types of reasons for why inequality matters through a political channel. And one is what one might call some Robin Hood taxation problem, that if a majority of poor people get together and get voting rights, for example, it's really fun to read some of the early, even progressive people in the 1800s were like super scared of extending the franchise to poor people, because obviously they would vote for, confiscation of and that would mean the end of industry and the end of the world as with civilized world as we know it, and that's a quote from the other way though is more talked about today, but also has some important pedigree sort of historically. That's the capture by an elite of the political process. That's the opposite. That's sort of saying that if inequality is super high in the sense that most of the resources are concentrated in a very small group of people, then they will set the rules. And this will be bad potentially for outcomes in the long run. It'll be good for them typically, but negative otherwise. Now, this is the framework in which I think I want to think about this. So let me just walk you through how I think about the relations here. So this part, the left part of this figure, essentially captures, I think, and this is a big statement, but I think every dynamic economic model can be captured in this part, in the sense that every model starts at some initial point. At that initial point, there's some distribution over resources in a broad sense, and then people make forward-looking decisions about how they should act, sort of and eventually interact in some market. Okay, so this is the initial distribution. These are the interactions in some kind of market, and they result in consumption, which is in these economics models the end goal. Sort of, you want to maximize the utility of your consumption. Well, you have some resources, and then you're thinking about, should I, start a firm? Should I work more? Should I go to school? Should I, whatever, all of that, right? And then this consumption and these savings, that gives you the initial distribution of the next period, right? That's the essential dynamic. Now, on this side, we have the political dimension of it, because this market does not sort of operate in a vacuum, right? So it operates under some institutional, in an institutional setting with rules and legislation, etc., which is determined through some political process. And that political process also, through taxes and transfers, impacts this final consumption and savings, right? So here you see clearly, that there are incentive effects, sure, but there's also decisions where, it's dependent on your initial resources, what you can do, etc. So this is going to impact the total output in the economy. And importantly, this is the starting point for the next period. So the problem that you get here, or that this illustrates, is this artificial insistence, or what I think is an artificial insistence on, we don't care about the distribution of outcomes, we care about the distribution of opportunity, right? I don't see how you sort of separate those two, because the outcome is always the starting point for someone's, initial opportunities. So they're always going to be linked. But then, finally, through this channel, a lot of inequality can result in people voting for, excessive taxation or populist politicians or something. So through the political process, this will create rules or, tariffs or something, just to take one random policy, which we think is negative for the final outcomes. But it's due to a lot of people, or sufficiently many people here, feeling that, this is not working for me. I want a different political setting. Or we can get concentration, high concentration, and then a lot of people who impact the political process so as to tailor the rules in their favor, etc. Okay. How long do you go normally? No. No, you go at least an hour, right? Okay. What should we measure? Okay, so let's agree that inequality matters, right? In economics. The question is then, if we want to sort of include it somehow, what should we be measuring? What is it that we want to look at? This, I think, is a nice initial point, which is important, which is that all inequality questions need to answer 3 W questions here. It's the inequality of what, between whom, and when. And there's so many disagreements that come out of people talking about different versions of this, right? So what can potentially be, wages, it can be total income, it can be wealth, it can be consumption, and the distribution across these might be different, and often is different, right? Between whom, again, it can be all individuals, and by all individuals I mean including kids. So and this, as soon as you think about it, kids are typically like dirt poor if you consider just the kids, right? So obviously you don't want a distribution over everyone with the kids in the bottom, or for some questions maybe yes, but that's not typically how we think about it. That's why we want to think of households where what matters is the household the kids live in, etc. For other questions, though, we might want to think about adults or even just the working population if we're, interested in questions of how should we think of, has technology increased the wages of the well-educated or something? Yeah, then we don't want to sort of dilute that questions with including all the kids and pensioners and everything. We want to focus then on, well, let's look at the labor market outcomes over the working population or something like this. And then also over what period is very important, because there's a lot of discussion about how some types of incomes are like very sporadic, if you wish. Others are, and then there's always this, if someone is annoyed with, someone pointing out that inequality is high, then they say, well, it doesn't matter, that students will become rich when they're, it doesn't matter that they're poor now because what matters is lifetime. Yeah, that's true. It depends on the question, and that's, always true here. Now, there are different levels at which, even if we were to think about all of those different W's, we can think of that from a macro point of view or from a sort of more micro individual utility point of view. And this, now closing in on more recent discussions, this, I think, is still somewhat underappreciated, that one of the most sort of recent innovations in the literature here is the World Income Distribution Project led by Thomas Piketty and others, which really aims at trying to distribute the full GDP of a country to its population. Now, that's a very different question than looking at sort of the distributed income that goes to households, the one that we typically look at in previous research, when you're looking at disposable income of individuals in households. Why is that different? Well, because there's a whole layer of GDP or of incomes which is stuck somehow in either in government or in pension funds or in firms. And the question is, as long as that money is in those institutions or in the firms, who does it belong to? Well, Piketty and others see no problem. It's like, well, the firm has an owner, so you just distribute according to who owns the firm, etc. But here, that's debatable. Yeah, then I'll get to the power over resources question. But let me just, I struggle with, if you have ideas of how to illustrate this. This is my new version of trying to illustrate this. But essentially, all economic resources, you can think of these as partly being the flow of income. This is the yearly GDP that we generate. Here's a stock of wealth. And this is, the Lucas point, that this flow of income quickly sort of dominates this stock of wealth in terms of value. So it is genuinely more important to have a country that year after year after year generates new economic values. But, there's a stock of wealth in the background as well. And this, is the macro. All macro models have this, they explain or try to model at least output as a function of, the capital stock and labor and some technology dimension. Now, at the individual level, individual households also have similar kind of structure. They work and get income from that, So they have some wage and they have some, hours they work, but they also own part of the capital stock, which generates interest. So this whole layer, approximately somewhere between 50 and 30% of GDP lies here. And the distribution of that is much debated. And depending on how you view that, you can get very different answers in terms of what has happened. So just to show the dynamics and coming back to the initial model, here we have the initial distribution of something. People work and do stuff, and this generates different types of income, which are distributed in the population. And then this sort of falls out to households, which make decisions then about consumption, etc. Right? So you see this parallel to the previous thing. Now here, you can then discuss wealth distribution, market outcome distribution, or disposable income. Just to, now take a step back. Now I'm talking about the distribution of this money. In discussions about this, Dalton famously, very early, article on this points out that, thinking about just the distribution of incomes, that's not what economists should strive to do. We should think about not the distribution of income as such, but the effects of the distribution of income upon the distribution of total amounts of economic welfare, right? So this, I would say, is what's behind what some would call the gold standard in measuring inequality. And that's individual disposable income adjusted for household circumstances. So the individual is the unit we care about. That's the unit of analysis. But the household is typically the unit of income. And this has consequences for a lot of things, right? Now, this in relation to definitions of income reveals something interesting, right? So these are classic economics definitions of what income is. And this boils down to that income is the consumption as well as the real net change in the value of your assets. Why? Well, because whether I consume or not in a given period of time, that's my choice, right? So what matters for the potential consumption is either did I earn some new money that I can use for consumption, or did something happen to my assets that made them grow in value in such a way that I could sell parts of this and at the end of the year have the same amount of resources as I had in the beginning of the year, right? Then that's an income as well. It's not necessarily a realized income. And this now turns out to be key, because if I own, a closely held firm, and my firm makes money, and that I'm not taking dividends or I'm not paying out anything from the firm, did I earn money in that period? Not according to tax statistics, because it's not distributed yet. So it doesn't appear anywhere in our normal measures. But potentially one could argue that, well, I decide on whether it pays out money to me or not. If to the extent I keep it there and save it, then that's like a tax-free savings account, right? Now this comes then to the relation between flows of income and assets and wealth. And this, now we're very close to why this matters a lot for the Swedish case, right? That income from wealth, that's by definition capital income. if you sell an asset, that's a realized capital gain potentially. So this is essentially what the structure of taxation looks like, which is the data source for when we calculate disposable income. And this explains why there's disagreement, and there should be disagreement, or about how you treat realized capital gains versus capital income, because they're very different in nature. Capital income means it's an income flow that you get from owning something, and you keep owning the thing that generates that flow. That's very different from selling something, because you can only sell that something once. And when you sell it, you potentially make a gain, and that's taxed. So this means that, this is really something that just changes your balance sheet, so to speak, but appears as an income that 1 year. So these are not the same types of income. Now, very quickly, what has happened? Now I've been, giving all these bells and whistles about different definitions, and you can do all sorts of things. Now, how does this matter? Well, this is what has happened to the inequality in Sweden over the past 30-odd years. This is showing 3 different versions of this. This top gray one here is when you include all of the realized capital gains. So this is what Statistics Sweden often, when they sort of publish this number, they show this, right? This down here below, which is significantly lower, excludes just the realized capital gains. But this includes capital income. So this is dividends and that flow. So I think that this is sort of, this is very clearly income, right? We can discuss how to distribute that over time, etc. But this is very clearly income. Now, there are some people who think that there's something dodgy about the capital income statistics. So there's been definitions that changed over time, etc. So maybe we should not, trust that this is comparable over time, etc. Okay, if you take that very hardline sort of position, which I don't buy, then this red thing is what you see. Now, how does this impact the discussion about this? Well, some people see a major increase, and some people claim that nothing's happened since the 2008. This is essentially that's what you see. I've seen people show this cutout and say look, this is all much exaggerated, and then I've seen same instance people showing this, saying that this is very different. This is similar to the discussion about whether Sweden is an extremely unequal country. Well, yeah, in terms of change in inequality, we are. So this is the percentage change in inequality, but this is Sweden in the 90s, right? We start very low. So this change, the fact that something changed in Sweden a lot more than it did in the US, etc., does not mean that Sweden is as unequal as the US, right? So that's also another thing.
What about wealth there?
No wealth here. We'll come to wealth. This is all disposable income at the household level, right? This is how this has played out over different time periods if you look across different percentiles. So this is repeated cross sections of 100 groups of people with these gray bars showing the average real income growth by percentiles since the mid-90s. So here we see that, yeah, it's true that over time, income growth has been positive everywhere. It's been slightly higher for people the higher up you go in the distribution, but it's been much, much higher for the very top. But interestingly, since around 2010, it's like, in Swedish pannkaksplatt. It's like really flat, surprisingly flat across the whole distribution, except for the very top. So there's clearly something going on in that top group, right? And what's going on is that, yeah, it's, here you see these are the income compositions of like 90% of the population. Here's like the top 10 minus the top 1%, and here's the top 1%. And here you see that what is really changing here is different types of capital income. Now, there's one important thing to point out here. When discussing top incomes, it's very easy to say, based on the previous stuff, that, yeah, the top has increased a lot. But I want to point out one thing about which top we're talking about here. This here is the top percent of the distribution of that same data, but now I've ordered people according to their labor income. So these are the top 1% of the labor income people. And then I look at what their share of disposable income, share of total income, total labor income has been, right? So this is relatively flat, right? So it's not that the top labor income people, they're not the ones increasing here. Not in terms of labor income in itself, but nor in terms of, once you add the capital income. It's not those individuals, right? Here, however, this is the top, but now defined according to disposable income. So here you see the gray line here is that top group, their share of labor income. Labor income has been less important for that group. They're earning a smaller share of total labor income. What they're earning is, capital income. What about wealth? So here, this is the part which is not in here and which I think is much neglected. Over this period, this is what has happened to liabilities, so our debt, and to the net, to the asset values over time. And this is these numbers in relation to GDP, so in relation to national income. So what we see is that since the 50s, for a very long time, that was relatively stable. But since the 90s, there's been a pretty big shift upwards in terms of the value of the wealth stock in relation to the yearly flow of income. And this means, to me at least, that it'd be nice to know more about the distribution of that part. And that we don't know that. So let me just illustrate, this. You'll have to trust me or, read this later, but this is a very, very rough approximation of what happens to the Gini coefficient. And this is just to illustrate that this idea that if we're looking at the income distribution, and then we're claiming nothing happened to the income distribution, and then we're looking at the distribution of wealth, and then we're saying nothing happened to the distribution of wealth, and then we're kind of forgetting that the proportions between these two changed over time. What kind of impact does that have on a Gini coefficient? Well, you can approximate that very easily by just saying that, if 90% of income comes from labor income, and that has a Gini coefficient which is relatively low, so say 0.3, well, as we know that the Gini of wealth is more like 0.9, and then it stays 0.3 and 0.9, but wealth goes up relative to income, then this has a huge impact potentially on the Gini coefficient. And this is why we cannot sort of just look at sort of what has happened to the wealth distribution in itself, what has happened to the income distribution in itself. We need to look at those jointly. And we need to think about, because there's also another thing here, which is the alignment coefficient between these two distributions. Is it the same people in the top of one and in the other? And as I showed before, it doesn't look like it's the very sort of labor income rich are not the same people as are in the top of the wealth distribution. So there's a lot of subtleties here that we need to know more about. But unfortunately, we don't have good data over the wealth distribution. Something which I've argued we should have, but politicians have decided that we don't need that. And full disclosure, I don't think that we should have wealth tax. I'm opposed to wealth tax. I could speak at length on why. I think it's like a third best solution, potentially. But I think it's the dumbest reason ever for not having data on this, because then we don't know what we're talking about. So because I frankly think that the reason for why not introducing data on this is the fear of reintroduction of a wealth tax. I'm so way over time now that, I'll basically wrap up here by saying that, look, we know a lot of stuff about what has happened in Sweden. There's certainly scope to have a better discussion, but for that kind of discussion to take place, people need to sort of at least stop a couple of minutes and think about which part of the distribution, what exactly are we talking about? Because Sweden very starkly sort of illustrates that it's not about increased labor income inequality. It's driven by capital income, and then we can have discussions about whether this is capital income only for tax purposes, or whether this is, should be labeled labor income, and we can have all sorts of discussions. But at least we should agree that nothing happens in the official statistics of this. Everything comes from the wealth part, and wealth has increased in relation to income, and this means that we need to get a better handle on what that wealth consists of and what the distribution of that looks like, etc. And just sort of saying that the distribution of that has not changed is not the end of the discussion in terms of how much this impacts overall economic inequality. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. It's lots of people here, lots of people online, and we're going to have a question and answer period. So let me remind you about the rules. If you're in person, raise your hand if you have a new question, and raise a finger if you want to follow up to anyone's question. And online, please use the Zoom chat to submit your question. And also, please tell me about your field, or because we like to file questions from different disciplines. And for follow-up, you start follow-up to the person you're following up to. So, I don't see any questions. There's no hands up. There's one hand over there and two hands up. Okay. All the way in the back, Anna Tillström.
Thank you so much for this. I'm super interested, especially in these new wealth holders that think only amateurs earn wages. Now you don't want to talk more, but I'm really interested. You said you were against the wealth taxation. You thought it was the third best solution. Then I wonder, very briefly, what's the first best solution? What's the second best solution? Because we do see a lot of social movements, like billionaires tax petitions, draw the line movements, like billionaires, very rich people asking to be taxed.
Yeah.
So you're the expert. What's the first and second best solution? Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. I could be pushed into discussing wealth taxes on like super rich people, potentially. I, however, think that there are so many ways in which taxing wealth per se, especially once you get down towards wealth, which can still be very substantial, but say in firms which are like very recent, they're not making any money yet, but their valuations are like crazy. I see all sorts of problems with making them pay taxes on wealth which is based on hopes about future incomes, right? That's my main concern with this. Wealth today does not necessarily mean cash flow today in some cases. And that's like the primary concern. Now, what should you tax instead? Well, you should tax the capital incomes. And I see that, and that I guess is, I should say that we already have wealth tax in Sweden. People just don't call it wealth tax. It's ISK is a wealth tax-based system. So it's not that it's totally unheard of, and some people are enthusiastic about that because it's simple, right? You don't have to keep track of exactly what gains you made this year or that year, but you just say that, well, on average, you're going to make this much money. So yeah, potentially that's one way of doing it.
But a lot of these super rich people, right, they have a lot of their assets in unlisted stocks and weird organizations that we cannot see in ISKs.
Yeah. No, so there are
they do have money, but just we can't see them in foundations.
No, and for sure, I'm much more positive, and I would push much more for international cooperation in terms of stopping people from moving their assets and hiding them outright, etc. Then exactly how we should tax them, that's difficult. But I say I'm not in favor of wealth tax mainly because I think that it's negative if the discussion about that is taken as a reason for not having data on it in the first place. I think that should not be the prime reason. But yeah, I take your point. There's a lot of difficulties in taxing wealth. My main objection to it is that there's wealth and value which is not tied to cash flow, and then that could be a problem.
Just follow up on that, because you didn't mention so much, but you touched on it. I mean, how do you calculate someone's wealth?
Yeah, no, so that's exactly the thing, right? That for some types of wealth, it's relatively easy, right? If you have a listed stock, there's a market price. So owning listed stock is pretty close to having cash, right? Because it's so liquid, you can sell it. But even if you're, the co-founder and owner of a family firm which is not listed, so it's not super easy to say exactly how much that is worth. And the way people do it is that, well, they look at the characteristics of a firm, for example, and then they look at what are similar firms which are listed, how much are they valued at, etc. But so
we had a wealth tax. What was it based on when we had it?
Yeah, that was based on the tax assessed wealth. Which, for housing, for example, that was always a joke because people did all sorts of things to keep down the taxation value and rather than the market value. And then occasionally when things became like way out of sync, one year they decided that now we're going to upgrade, and then everyone was hit by a shock to their wealth tax on that housing, etc. So there were many things that were odd with that system, and I would agree with those who said that the way the wealth tax system worked in Sweden was that very wealthy people did not really pay that wealth tax either. Yeah, but
Anyway, Anna, were you satisfied with that?
I'm very satisfied.
Tanya.
No, it was exactly a follow-up because you said there was no data, but still you had the opinion that you thought it's wrong with a wealth tax. And I think, how can you make this statement if you don't have the data? I mean, there has to be another argument to get the data then, but not come to a conclusion before you have the data.
Yeah.
And then the other thing was also if you could give concrete examples on the slide of where you had the Gini coalition. Could you give an example to? I mean, this is very abstract for someone who's not in your field. That would be nice.
An example of what? Sorry.
I mean, show an example from empirical research where you have maybe a company or someone on this, this approximation slide.
So sorry, on this one.
Do you have a concrete case which you could exemplify what is lost and what is gained and what you mean with it?
Maybe the question is just about how the Gini works, and it's a distance to perfect equality.
Yeah, and I would like to get an example.
Yeah. So yeah. Sorry about that. This is so the Gini coefficient is essentially an attempt to get like one number on something which is a complex thing, right? So it's the distribution over a whole population, and if you look at empirical data, then the Gini coefficient for disposable income varies between like 0.2 and 0.6 roughly. So 0 would mean that everyone has identical income. And the closer you get to 0, everyone has identical income, right? So 0.2 is relatively close to people having very equal incomes. 0.6 is quite a bit further away from that, right? A Gini coefficient of 1 would mean that one person holds everything, right? Now, if total income comes from two sources, one is work, so that's like the distribution of wages. If we look at empirical, so these are not just random numbers. I've taken numbers that somewhat correspond to what we know from data. So labor income is much more evenly distributed. So 0.3 is a reasonable coefficient for that. So that's one type of one source of income that has one distribution. The other is what's the distribution of wealth, right? And wealth is much, much more unequally distributed. So estimates of wealth distribution in Sweden are a little bit above 0.9, or so it's almost as if one person, if not one person, then a couple of percentage points of the population own almost all of the wealth.
And quite bad internationally, if you compare it internationally.
Yeah, so it's a very skewed distribution also in Sweden compared to many other countries. Now, what this is attempting to illustrate is that if wealth is a source of income, right, in the sense that when you own something, it potentially has a return. So you get dividends from stocks, you get returns on interest rates, or you get rent from housing or something like that. So these returns create a flow which mirrors the distribution of wealth. So they're much, much more skewed, which you also saw in if you look at here, most of what we see in terms of interest and dividend and realized capital gains, they appear in the top of the distribution, right? Because it's a very skewed distribution. Now, what this was attempting to say, trying to say, was that even if nothing happens to the distribution of the wealth, the distribution remains extremely skewed. But wealth becomes more important as a source of income. So a larger chunk of the income flow that we get every year comes from that part.
Okay, but then you seem to start from the same presumption as Rutger Bregman, but his conclusion would be tax for rich, and your conclusion is the opposite. So
no, my conclusion, I nowhere said don't tax the rich. I said don't tax wealth in itself. Tax the flow of income that comes from wealth. That's a very different thing, right? So, no. And also, the rich, who are the rich? Well, as I showed, there are those who are working rich. In the Swedish case, they're not the ones that have gained enormously compared to others, which is different from the US, right? So it matters how you define the rich, but let's assume you define them according to their total income. Then that total income depends both on, their labor income and on their capital income. My suggestion would be that you should tax the flow from the capital side more than we do today, but not tax the wealth holding in itself. And that's tricky because people can choose, especially if you have this layer. That's what I meant with the layer between like the macro outcomes and the individuals, that there's all these firms and organizations in between. And in some cases, the boundary between you as an individual and this, say, holding corporation, which serves one purpose only, which is to hold on to your money until you decide to take it out. Today we're not taxing that kind of money sufficiently. But that's not the same as saying that tax the wealth per se. I'm saying we should become better at taxing the flow of new income, because then there's always a tax capacity. It's never a question of this is just a valuation and then there's no sort of underlying flow of money. That's the problem with saying that, oh, here's a valuation of this thing, but I don't have any money. I can't.
Good.
Right?
Marcus.
You don't seem super convinced, but we can continue.
And basically, you said you could tax the rich because you want to tax the capital.
Yeah, exactly. No, so that's a very different thing, right?
Okay, great. So I'm interested in the historical slides, a few slides after this, over time. Yeah. So
this one?
Yeah, sure. And it relates to the exchange you had with Anna, the first question. About how reliable these data are in light of the fact that measures have changed and the wealth tax has been abolished. And I guess also that the level of tax avoidance and tax evasion must have also varied over time. So are there any caveats when looking at this data that we should keep in mind, or are there any specific explanations for some of the bumps in these curves? And how reliable would you say that they are? How comfortable are you with these numbers as of today?
So that's a big question, right? This is data essentially based on national accounts. So national accounts have one part which looks at the flow of GDP, which is what we most often cite. But in the background, there's also someone who keeps track of the stock of wealth, right? And for sure, in other research that I've done jointly with Daniel on the wealth distribution, it's very clear that if you compare like the profitability of firms, for example, compared to their valuation prior to 1980, say, and especially in the 70s and 80s, the valuation of Swedish companies was like super low in relation to how profitable they were. Why? Well, because there was essentially no marketplace for them. So, I mean,
Currency regulation, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So financial regulation and all sorts of things made it very hard to trade in these assets. So the valuation of these companies in relation to how profitable they were was like super low. And especially in the 80s, there was still talk about the famous löntagarfonderna, the sort of wage earner funds, right? So the potential confiscation of these assets, so that also had clear depressing effect, right? Now, famously, if you look at Swedish stock market development compared to like wage development since the 80s, it's been a really good idea to have your money in the stock market as compared to working or having average wage gains over this period. And for sure, parts of that have to do with these valuations being depressed. And also, parts of this, we know famously that many Swedes, rich Swedes, moved their money out of the country, etc. I mean, this is also something I've done some work on like long ago, but it's this idea that Sweden's so exceptional in terms of high concentration of like super rich people. That's not a new phenomena. If when I did work on this like late 90s, the big decider was how you count being Swedish. Is it by citizenship or is it where you hold your money? And if you counted by citizenship, then Sweden was like up there with Monaco and Cayman Islands already in the 90s, in terms of concentration of wealth or having a small number of like internationally super rich individuals. So that's not new. It's just that, some of them are still in other countries or their money resides in other countries, while some of them are not. Is this a good thing, bad thing? So what we observe often is through the sort of business press and others who are interested in these questions. We look at like a handful or sometimes up to like 100 individuals. But of course, there's a lot of people underneath that are also like substantially wealthy who shift their funds out of the country for various reasons, right? So, and there, I would guess that since 2007, there's no real tax reason to leave Sweden. Sweden is a super good place if you have a lot of money. And indeed, it's so good that some people are moving here, with their money. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on that. But, what I do think is a problem is that we don't have better cooperation across countries so that this kind of shifting of money around is possible in the first place. Indeed, I was glad to hear nobody ever mentions my dissertation anymore, but the political economy of not paying taxes was exactly about this question. It's like, how should we think about redistributive politics in a world where a fraction of the population potentially just says, if you tax me, I'm going to move my money abroad. Now, it turns out that it has interesting implications which move exactly in the direction that, yeah, the ones paying the high taxes will be the working rich and those who are rich, but just too poor to to be amongst those who can move their money abroad, right? So, this is like a super long answer and maybe not even answering your question, but
Okay.
this is official statistics. I'm very confident that there's this kind of increase. Exactly why, etc., I don't know. But part of this long period of low valuation is certainly has to do with regulation, etc.
Great, thanks.
So it's a new question or follow up?
It's a new question.
Okay, so we write you up here. Next question is Ole Hammar. Online. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Are you
So
not
I'm
afraid?
traveling. Sorry. hope you hear me, anyways. So yeah, thanks a lot for this great overview. But I was interested in your sort of final comment about, if I understood it correctly, that we should study the joint distribution of income and wealth. And to me, that in one way, because I know some people do it, but in one way it becomes sort of double counting.
Yeah.
I mean, when we study the income distribution of both labor income and capital income, we're taking into account, the flow from wealth. So I was just wondering if you'd a little bit of how you think about how one should study the combination of both the flow and the stock.
Yeah. No, that's a super good point. I was very careful, I hope, to say that in my sort of approximation of how this would shift, the Gini, I said, assume we have this distribution over the labor income, and then we assume that all of the capital income is like R times the capital holdings of individuals. So it would be in concrete terms that you exclude, of course, the capital income flows that we observe. Now, I have played around a little bit with this just to see, we know what we observe in terms of capital income increases, right? And we know also how the relation between the stock of wealth and the income flow has changed, right? So then we can back out, and I tried doing this, try to back out if we take all of the money that we do observe in the tax statistics on capital incomes, and then we compare this to what should we expect that this kind of increase in the wealth stock generates in terms of capital incomes, right? Then to me, it ends up with some money being retained still some money has not been distributed out in what we observe. So there's some income gains which lie behind, the increased valuation of the capital stock, right?
Happy with that, Ole?
But
convinced him. Not bad. Anandi, should get a microphone.
Thank you. Can you go back to the framework slide with the pictures in the corner? Because that was what sort of triggered my question.
This one?
Yeah, that one. So I noticed that all those billionaires are in tech. And that made me wonder whether that has a bearing on the framework and also on another way or other ways in which distribution might matter. Because one of the things that they have a lot of control over is information.
Yeah.
Not just information that influences the political process, but also that influences individual decisions in the market, right? You think about the algorithms that recommend new things that you might want to buy, but also social media. Then there's also this question about like new AI systems and how they might directly influence labor income. So there's like, it seems like maybe there's some interesting further ways in which distribution might matter beyond those that are represented in the framework, particularly nowadays with AI.
Yeah. No, so big question, but certainly one that I think is very, very interesting. I mean, I'm reluctant to start rambling because sort of it's not that I didn't think about it, but every time I try to think about it, my head explodes, right? Because in a way, and maybe this is what you're thinking about, but this kind of how is it negative that these guys influence the political process? Well, in my thinking, and up until recently at least, it's been mainly through the fact that being an economist, I think that markets where there's competition, that's a good thing, right? So competitive markets is something to strive for. If we go back to the previous Gilded Age and the way in which concentration of money had power over the political process, then it was through the creation of monopolies, etc. So I have a toolbox for analyzing how is that negative for the excess surplus of in relation to a perfectly competitive market, etc. I can see, that we should not allow this monopolist to do this or that, or to set prices, regulate markets, etc. So that's essentially, like I sometimes say, that this is like the Chicago School version of why you should care about inequality. Inequality is bad for competition through that kind of process. Now, what I hear you saying is that my whole world in terms of what is a perfectly competitive market is all messed up now, because these guys, or whatever they represent, they control both the supply side and the demand side through the informational connection between them, right? So they can exploit both the consumers as well as the producers and hog all of the surplus, both the producer surplus and the consumer surplus, in my little toy model, right? Yeah, that's not good. We don't want that. That's certainly not a perfect market, right? But it's sort of not only through some kind of monopoly version, but rather, all of the producers of the world are also relying on these guys, because there's, how does competition work? Well, these guys decide if you even see that I'm producing this thing, because I'm going to be online searching for stuff. Of course, that's, the potential is there. And early on, when internet sort of appears, there's all this very enthusiastic things about how markets will now become perfect. Because now we'll have all of the information and everyone can see, and compete. Yeah, except that there's potentially someone who controls who sees that information. And then it's a different ballgame, right? So are there other questions that enter into this? Yeah, I'd say so. And that is really, but it's just, I don't know even how to start to think about that. Well, start to think, but I think it's something we need to think a lot more about, because the whole framework of how we think of competition, is really dependent on. When I teach this to undergrads, it's like, yeah, there's this, demand curve, and then there's this supply curve, and then they meet somehow magically, and then, well, that meeting is mediated through these people, and they decide who meets whom. And they can potentially extract exactly your willingness to pay and exactly my willingness to sell. And then whatever I would normally gain and you would gain, they extract that, that difference.
I follow quickly up that. Is that a difference in kind or difference in degree from, in the United States, media is owned by, 7 big corporations. And that's also controlling the same thing that these guys now can control even better. Or?
Not really.
Okay.
No, it's I'd say it's a little different, because controlling information is important, clearly, for a lot of things, but it's not the same, and we're not there yet. I mean, what I'm talking about is like a situation where every market interaction is mediated through these people or their tools. We're not there, right? And it's unlikely that we'll end up in that kind of situation fully, but we're certainly moving in that direction. There's a lot more of the interactions, of the trades that are mediated through them. And that, I think, gives them different kinds of power than just power over information. But that's important. But I think it's a different kind of issue.
On that note, sadly, we're running out of time, so I apologize for those who would like to ask questions. But join me in thank you for this very inspiring talk. I think I'm going to give up my job and just start working with it. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks.
There are more
And-
talks.
And get in touch if you have questions. I'm super happy to discuss further. So.
Great. There are talks coming up. 18th of March, we have Stephanie Plenty from here. We're going to talk about students with optimistic outlooks. Do they really succeed? And that's with Frida Rodolfi, too, I think. And then 25th of March, we have Ulrika Winblad, who is Professor of Health Services Research. I don't know what title of the talk, but it's probably going to be something about public health. And then 6th of May connects to your talk today. We have Ingrid Robbins, Professor of Practical Philosophy at Utrecht University. She's going to talk about something called limitarianism, whether it's immoral to have too much and whether we should limit that. Thank you.